Maggie. I'm a licensed clinical psychotherapist with degrees in psychology, theology, and marriage and family therapy, a national certification in dialectical behavioral therapy, and a national certification in integrative mental health. In this video, I'm not looking to diagnose anyone. I'm only willing to offer insight into situations like these. Happy Sunday. I am so ready to dig into this. So let me say hi to some people real quick. Adric first. He says it's on. Nina, my favorite auntie, is in here. Hi with the peace sign. Adrian says, let's go. And Catching Up with the Joneses is here. Happy Sunday. And for all of you watching, please feel free to say hello in the comments. I have the best live tribe on YouTube, so I hope you can join that. Spain Man is here. Hi, how are you? Okay, I'm ready to get into it. So I'm starting with the disclaimer. Okay. Hopefully everybody watched part 1. If you didn't, go back and watch it. I'm not doing any reviewing because this is going to end up having a part 3 and possibly a part 4. So, like I said, there's a lot I want to show you. So we're just going to dive in. Disclaimer. It is not anti-Semitic to point out that certain elites throughout history, including the Khazar ruling class, have strategically adopted Judaism not as a matter of faith, but as a tool for political sovereignty, identity control, and economic insulation. Just as the Vatican weaponized Christianity to justify imperial expansion, and the British Crown cloaked colonization in divine monarchy, some elite families used Jewish identity not to elevate a people, but to shield their own power. Critiquing those historical power moves is not hatred of Jews. It is a rejection of using any religion, Judaism included, as a camouflage for conquest, manipulation, and unearned legitimacy. If you can call out papal tyranny without being anti-Christian, or condemn Western colonialism without being anti-European, then you can damn well expose elite identity fraud without being anti-Semitic. The real anti-Semitism is pretending all Jewish people share the guilt of a few who turned sacred identity into a political weapon. That is my disclaimer. So, I'm going to show you this. Identity firewall. And this is what we're going to keep looking at, okay? Because, let me get this pulled up here. Because it is a strategic use of cultural, religious, or racial identity as a shield against criticism, accountability, or investigation, especially when that identity is invoked by individuals or institutions in power to protect non-ethical behavior, exploitation, or manipulation. It functions much like a digital firewall, blocking, deflecting, or discrediting any incoming challenge not based on merit or truth, but based on the protected status of the identity itself. Feel free to use that. Feel free to use that. Spainman says that's too much like common sense, though. Okay, so we're going to keep going from part 1, right? Now, anybody who's been on my channel for a while knows that there are times that I say that the elites, the 1%ers, the people at the tippity top, that the way that hierarchy operates is bloodlines. Now, this is not an argument for eugenics, so please don't come after me about that. I'm chasing bloodlines because these bloodlines chase power, okay? Bloodlines are the original secret societies. So Before there were Masonic lodges or Bilderberg meetings, there were dynastic families passing down wealth, land, titles, networks, and secret knowledge, or things that are sacred sounding to justify their domination. Okay, these lineages aren't just holding on to like family photos and heirlooms. They're maintaining institutional control across governments, banking systems, religious hierarchies, and secret orders. So I'm chasing the bloodlines. So let's talk about the Khazar bloodlines. So the theory goes that after the fall of the Khazar Empire, the elite families didn't disappear. Of course they wouldn't. They were elite. They had money, right? They relocated and re-embedded themselves into the Polish, Lithuanian, Commonwealth, Kievan Rus, and eventually into the Ashkenazi merchant and rabbinic elite. Over time, those families rose again, becoming powerful financiers, diplomatic agents, and religious gatekeepers. And part one talks about how the proof is in the pudding, right? We do know that there is some genetic admixture, so we know they mixed in. And shortly after they mixed in, everybody's following the same playbook that the Khazars used. So proof is in the pudding. The Khazar elite model parallels the Vatican, the British Crown, and Zionist statecraft in their use of religion, economic power, cultural influence, and survival tactics. Okay. The trade routes and the diasporan framework map shows how the Khazar Empire's decentralized trade and diplomatic outposts laid a blueprint that was then used by Venetians, the British Empire, and modern Zionist diaspora networks, each adapting and scaling the model in slightly different ways, but it's the same thing. In this view, the Khazar bloodlines adapted, shapeshifted, and reemerged in other ruling class cloaks, just like Roman elites morphed into the papal elite, or Gothic warlords became European monarchs. So if you watched Goths #1, you will know about that as well. And just so that you're aware, we're going to have Khazars #3 next Sunday, and then the following Sunday, we're going to have Goths #2, and you will see why as we go through this. So let's talk about the split between being an ethnic Jew and a secular Jew. So the first one that we know about is Baruch Spinoza. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some numbers here. In a Pew Research Center's 2013 report, a portrait of Jewish Americans found that 1/3 of all U.S. Jews under the age of 30 called themselves Jews of no religion. If that seems problematic, the very thought that one could be Jewish without Judaism was inconceivable to our ancestors, right? Before Baruch Spinoza. All that changed on July 27th, 1656, the day the leaders of the Talmud Torah, the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam, excommunicated 24-year-old philosopher Baruch Spinoza. Although the writ of excommunication did not specify Spinoza's abominable heresies, didn't say what it was, right? But he's a philosopher, so probably thinking was the problem. We know from his later published works that he denied almost every major tenet of traditional Jewish belief, including that God created and controls the world, that God makes ethical demands on us, that the Torah is the revelation of God's will, and that Jews are God's chosen people. So he pretty much didn't believe any of it. He also dared to criticize religion, all religions, for propagating untruths and fostering dogma and superstitions that had led to great evils perpetrated in the name of God. I like this guy. So now we have this split of ethnic or secular or both. This is where this split started happening. The Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, and the Jewish emancipation of the 1700s are sold to us as liberation stories. Okay. Now, this is right after Baruch Spinoza is excommunicated from being a, a religious Jew, and now he's an ethnic Jew. Okay. So we have the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, and the Jewish emancipation of the 1700s. Those were about restructuring Jewish identity to fit the Enlightenment empires that were happening at the time. So it was about you have to break the traditional power structures inside the Jewish communities and integrate the things that are now elite acceptable into the story. You have to change the story now. So we have to have enlightenment. Now, again, like I said in the beginning, all of this is about the elites. This did not help. This was not about the everyday Jewish guy. Okay, so let's break down what happened. The Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, was late 1700s to around the early 1800s. It was in Germany and Austria. Remember Germany when we get to Goths number 2? And spread to Poland, Russia, and beyond. So what it was a movement by European Jewish intellectuals to modernize Jewish culture and modernize the religion and modernize the identity by aligning with the ideals of the European Enlightenment. So all about reason, science, and secularism. So they really took a hold of being one or the other, right? You could be ethnically Jew, or you could be secularly Jew, or you could be both. So this was inspired by Moses Mendelssohn, who believed that Jews should learn secular languages like German, that they should engage in science, arts, and philosophy. Poor Baruch was a little bit early, and integrate into European civil society without abandoning Judaism entirely. So what it really came out was, it was a strategic shift by Jewish elites to gain favor and protection from the European aristocracy and bourgeoisie. It was a departure from being Torah-centered and the traditional authority, especially the rabbis and the elders, in favor of a Western liberal humanist type approach. Religion became privatized. Jewish identity became cultural. Okay, now you can be a cultural Jew, paving the way for Zionism. Okay, Reform Judaism also came out, and secular Jewish nationalism also came out. So the Jewish emancipation was the process by which the European Jews were gradually granted civil rights and citizenship by European states, particularly after the French Revolution. So that's good for the average Joe, right? In France, the Jews were emancipated in 1791 during the French Revolution, and that France was the first country to do so. In Austria, under Joseph II, so that was the emperor, Joseph II's Edict of Tolerance in the late 1780s allowed Jews to attend schools and universities, hold some jobs, and live in cities. Now, prior to this, Jewish people had their own schools. They had their own universities. They had their own jobs. They were very insular as part of the doctrine, okay? But we had the Enlightenment, okay? So Prussia, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, they all had their emancipations unfolding throughout the 1800s. They were usually conditional on assimilation. If you assimilate into the culture, then you can have rights. So what was promised was the end of ghettos, equal rights, freedom of occupation, movement, worship, all of those things. But what was required? Abandon communal autonomy, so that separatist, renounce separate legal status, okay, because Jewish people also had their own court system, their own laws, and their own governance up till that time. Okay, think like Native Americans, okay? They were to adopt national languages, dress like the national people and act like them too. And it was to conform to bourgeois norms of religion and citizenship. And this is framed as Jewish liberation. And the elites were very on board with this, but it was essentially taking away what they had inherently had within their own system. Adrian says, up until this time, Jews preferred to live in their ghettos. Well, and even that we call them ghettos or that they have a bad connotation, they were separate and handling their own business, okay? So what are the hidden layers? Number one, divide and rule. It's always divide and rule, right? Emancipation didn't free all Jews. It favored the elite, Western-facing, Enlightenment-aligned Jews while alienating the traditional Hasidic and Sephardic communities. It created a class divide within the Jewish world. Western Jews were seen as respectable, civilized, and assimilated, while Eastern Jews were backward, tribal, and ghettoized. So again, this is helping the elites and not the average Jew. That same divide plays out today in politics, academia, and Zionism. So we're back to the identity firewall, right? Emancipation allowed elites to co-opt Jewish identity for state building. The Jews went from being a sovereign religious community to citizens of the state, with Jewishness defined by culture or ethnicity, no longer by divine law. This shift laid the ideological groundwork for secular Zionism, which needed a version it needed part of this Jewish identity that wasn't bound by religion, but still strong enough to unite all these people together. So then we move into the Jacobins during the French Revolution. So this is 1789 to 1794. So who were the Jacobins? This is a radical political group during the French Revolution. They were led by Robespierre. Do you guys remember that from school? Robespierre, Danton, and some others. They advocated for equality, secularism, so again, the separation, and the abolition of a monarchy on paper. This is what they were saying. But what did they do? They engineered the Reign of Terror. So 1793 to 1794, mass executions via guillotine. They overthrew the aristocracy, church privilege, and all the feudal structures. They claimed to serve the people, but operated through this violent centralization of power. So doing the same thing, but saying it's for a different reason. We've all heard this play before too, huh? So what was really going on? The Jacobins weren't just revolutionaries, right? They were shock troops for the new managerial elite. It's to get the other Jews on board. They destroyed the monarchy, but they paved the way for Napoleon, another centralized autocrat. And they really didn't even destroy the monarchy, right? Because when Napoleon overthrew Germany, where the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was based, he just went and became king of Austria and still was over Germany and the Holy Roman Empire. Even the Holy Roman Empire fell. They didn't actually change into the Roman Catholic Church for another like 60 something years. So behind the scenes, banking families and Enlightenment era secret societies like the Rosicrucians and proto-Masonic groups were influencing the ideology and funding the chaos. So now we move into the communist industrial complex. So what is that? This refers to the alignment of the communist ideology, so the Marxist-Leninist, with mass industrial power and state machinery. It was most visible in the Soviet Union, Mao's China, the Eastern Bloc, and even modern technocratic type regimes. It works through promises, right? It promises equality for the masses, but creates absolute state control of the economy, education, thought, even thought, and movement. Now remember movement from episode 1 of this. The proletariat revolution is quickly absorbed by the new elite, the party apparatus, which functions like an oligarchic priesthood. Industry is centralized, labor is regimented, and the state becomes the god in this system. So this is where we get, it almost feels like spirituality is taken away from us and we are given politics in place of it. So here's the twist. Communist revolutions often had external funding, especially during the Bolshevik Revolution, where the Western bankers, including Schiff, Warburg, and Morgan, all Jewish people, are documented supporting Lenin. It becomes a mirror of this Jacobin model: destroy the old monarchy plus religion, and then install a new centralized ideology under the red banners instead of the royal ones. Same thing, it's the same play, different name. And this happens all throughout history. It's the same play, different name. The Jacobins helped shift from monarchy to secular state empire. So still an empire, right? How does that help the everyday man? It doesn't. Communism shifted from capitalist elites to state-administered elites, a technocratic monarchy in disguise. Both targeted religion, history, tradition, and the family unit, not to liberate people, but to make them more dependent on the state as the new God King. The state is now your king. So let's talk about one of the most crucial, misunderstood, and intentionally obscured chapters in global history: the establishment of Israel. The establishment of Israel wasn't simply about returning to a biblical homeland, although that is the story, right? It was a highly strategic political decision built on elite interests, colonial alliances, and global positioning. And the price of that decision was the Nakba, the catastrophe endured by Palestinians, which is still ongoing today. So we'll break it down step by step. Okay? So the Jewish idea of, I'm going to be very clear. The Zionist idea of a Jewish homeland. We're going to talk about that first. This is where we get into, I sure hope they don't take this down. All right. So in the late 1800s, late part, Theodor Herzl and other secular European Jews, secular, okay, meaning not religious at all, launched the Zionist movement. They argued that Jews needed a nation state due to anti-Semitism and marginalization in Europe, where they had previously fought for not being separate and being absorbed and assimilated into Europe. Now they're saying we need a whole nation state now. Zionism wasn't spiritual. It was territorial. It was political and heavily influenced by European nationalism and colonial strategies. Yes, Herzl was an atheist, Spain man. Yes. Okay. So if Israel is the homeland, let me ask you this. Why were other locations considered? Because it's political and it's about having territory and being part of this global trading network. It was not about a return to the homeland when all this was going on. That was later propaganda that was brought in. Okay. So Israel, which at that time was Ottoman Palestine, was not the only, it was a candidate, but it wasn't the only candidate. Some other potential homelands were seriously proposed and even debated. Okay. So number one, Uganda. Okay. So the Uganda plan, which is in British East Africa, because remember, Britain thinks they own everything, right? In 1903, it was proposed by Herzl. He's the one who came up with this plan. And he's saying we need land in Africa. But I thought it was a return to the homeland. Okay. Even the British government was thinking about, yeah, that sounds like a good plan. Their idea is that it established a Jewish homeland in present day Kenya or possibly Uganda. But Kenya is where they were really actually looking. Hi, cynical optimist. Hi, Wayne Fields. Thank you for being here. Wayne Fields says, I just went through a whole series of your videos, and since you happen to be live, let me show my gratitude and appreciation again for all the knowledge and insights. Thank you so much from Belgium. You are so very welcome, and thank you for joining the live tribe. You are going to remind me, though, to tell you guys 60% of my viewers are return viewers who haven't subscribed. So if anybody hasn't hit the subscribe button, please do so. That helps this information to get out. Okay. And if you share it, that helps too. So so for 2 years, they were thinking, okay, we're going to do this Kenya, Uganda homeland, return to the homeland in Africa. Okay. Now, spoiler alert, there are Hebrews in Africa that modern Jewish people, especially the Zionists, say, well, they can't possibly be Jewish. So how is if you think that, doesn't it sound hypocritical to say your homeland is in Africa? Thank you, Adric. Like, share, subscribe. So by 1905, the Zionist Congress, so now they've got their Congress, right? It was rejected after strong opposition from Eastern European Zionists who really wanted Israel. They wanted it called Eretz Israel. They prefers Israel. So, okay. So then they decided to look at Argentina. Rat lines, anybody? Then they decided to look at Argentina. That was considered due to vast land and low population density. Less people to bomb and murder and kick out of their houses, right? It's just less trouble because there's not as many people there. So we'll just say our homeland is in, let me throw a dart, Argentina. It appealed to most of the Zionist thinkers, but they really couldn't, make it resonate with the Bible. Apparently that's what Africa did, since, the Bible has all these African places in it, including Jesus going to Egypt. But it didn't really resonate with the Bible because the Bible, in the Torah never mentioned Argentina. And they noted this, it was not a good strategic location for European support. So we're back to trade hubs, right? So another place that was looked at was, I'm going to tear up this name, Soviet Birobidzhan. So this is a Jewish autonomous oblast. So this is in 1934. Stalin offered a remote area in eastern Russia near China. He said, here, there's some land over here. Some Jews actually relocated to that area, but it was remote, it was cold, and culturally nobody knew what was going on there. So it was kind of alien, It was a bad cultural awakening. So it didn't really gain a lot of serious momentum. But some Jews did go there and make it their homeland. Spainman says Palestine was called a beautiful bride that belonged to another man in the late 1800s. Oh, okay. Then another idea was Madagascar. Again, this is sold to us as a homegoing, okay? But this proposal was not made by um, even the Jewish elites, right? This was proposed by Nazi Germany in the late 1930s to relocate all the European Jews to Madagascar as their separate nation state. This was proposed. Okay, you guys want your own spot. Everybody go to Madagascar. Now, of course, the Nazis are very eugenics based, right? So it comes across much more like an exile and not a homegoing. And it was ultimately abandoned. Nobody really got on board with Madagascar. Spainman says that homeland is pretty fluid, huh? Yeah, it sure is. So why did they choose Palestine? Okay, remember, this is part of the Ottoman Empire. This is Ottoman Palestine. The whole thing is Palestine. Okay. So why did they choose Palestine? So they could make that biblical Torah connection to Eretz Israel. Now, if you remember some of my other shows, especially like Who Are the Shasu, I showed that Israel was not a place. It was the name of a tribe called Israel. Just like the names of any other tribes that was the name of their tribe. It was never a place, okay? But they had this connection. They could see Israel in the Torah, in the Bible, and it made it much easier to market to Jews and Christians alike. They could get on board because the Bible says, right? The narrative of returning to the land was created at that time for this spiritual cover for this political project, right? Identity firewall. We're taking land, we're kicking people out, and you can't say anything about it because Jew, okay? That's identity firewall right there. Adrian says, no Madagascar. I guess they didn't like to move it. Now that song's going to be in my head. Okay. The other thing that they liked about Palestine was it was positioned between Europe, Africa, and Asia. Trade lines again, right? It is near the Suez Canal. That is a critical colonial artery that is controlled by Britain. And it's ideal for serving as a Western military and intelligence outpost in the Middle East. So, quid pro quo. All right. Now, because of those things, did Europe think it was okay? Were they on board with it? Well, we had the Balfour Declaration in 1917, where Britain promised to support a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, if that's where they chose to go, while also promising Arab independence. Fingers crossed. Sorry, guys. Spainman says, enter the unsinkable aircraft carrier. Yeah. So, who else supported this? The Rothschilds. And if you've looked into any of this, that name is not uncommon to you. British Zionists like Chaim Weizmann, the Rothschilds, they all had these deep ties, these powerful banking families, and they were all very much in support of a Jewish homeland in that particular location because of where it's located, okay? Zionism aligned with the British imperial goals. It was helping control the region and divide all the Arab unity that was going on. Okay. Divide and rule, right? Divide and rule. So let's talk about the Nakba. So what happened? Nakba is Arabic for catastrophe. It refers to the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians during and after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. In 1947, the UN created a partition plan. Now imagine you're sitting in your home in Palestine with your wife and kids, or, with your husband and kids. You have a job, everything is great. You saved up money, you bought a house, you have property, yada, yada, yada. And you hear about that the UN has decided to partition your country. The UN proposed splitting Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, even though Jews made up only 30% of the population and owned less than 7% of the land. So all these Palestinians, 70% of the population, 93% of the landowners. The plan gave Jews 55% of the territory, 55% of the land. So from 1947 to 1940, the Palestinians weren't like, oh, okay, come in, take my house. So 1947 to 1948, and thank you, Adrian, reminding people to hit the like button and the replay gang, and shout out to the replay gang. Please do so. So 1947 to 1948, the Zionist militias, the Haganah, some of these words, the Irgun and the Lehi launched coordinated military campaigns to seize the territory and expel the Arabs. Get out of that house. We're moving somebody else into that house. Only take what you can carry, and the rest of your property is now theirs. Then we have the Deir Yassin massacre on April 9th, 1948. So over 100 Palestinian civilians were slaughtered by Zionist paramilitaries. It triggered mass fear and panic across all of the Palestinian villages and towns. Of course it did. Then we had Operation Plan Dalet, which was a systematic military strategy to depopulate and destroy Palestinian towns. Over 500 towns were destroyed, and more than 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly displaced. Because I'm going to curse for a second, excuse me ahead of time, because your shit is now somebody else's shit. Because Judaism. Okay? So remember, all of this wasn't because they had an issue with the Palestinians. Nobody had an issue with the Palestinians. Palestinians were never framed as bad guys. They weren't doing all these heinous things. They weren't doing anything wrong. They're just there existing, doing their thing. The Jews didn't even have an issue with the Palestinians other than you're in the way. You're in your house and it's now my house. Get out. Okay? The Palestinians didn't do anything wrong. It was simply because these Jewish Zionists wanted the land and the property. So May 14th, 1948, Israel had enough of the land and property, right? And they declared independence, right? We're not under anybody's rule. We are now our own nation state. The next day, Arab states intervened, but the narrative of a defensive war matched the prior ethnic cleansing already underway. So as soon as they declare independence and say, yep, all this is mine, the Arab states were like, bro, what are you talking about? But by that time, they're entrenched. Spainman says, quote, we have forgotten that we have not come to an empty land to inherit it, but we have come to conquer a country from people inhabiting it. Moshe Sharet in 1915. The last video I show in this series is really going to speak to that. Okay. So the effects of the Nakba are still ongoing to this day. Obviously, if you watch the news, we know what's happening over there, right? Genocide. Millions of Palestinian refugees have never been allowed to return. As a matter of fact, you can watch stories of Palestinian refugees who were put in these camps, right? And when they cut the land, talking about they could see other people living in their home, picking their oranges, eating their fruit from where they were behind the fence. Okay. Land, homes, and property confiscated under the absentee property law. So they kicked everybody out and put them in camps. And then they said, well, if you abandon your property, it can be confiscated by the state. So it's ours now. The refugee population just only grows, right? I mean, not now. Most people living in Gaza, the Western Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the right of return is always denied. However, millions have been killed, since October. Military occupation, checkpoints, home demolitions, and apartheid policies continue to this day. In fact, now Netanyahu is on his Greater Israel. He's expanding. He wants all of Palestine, but then also surrounding areas. You guys can look that up, Greater Israel. The choice of Palestine as the Jewish homeland was strategic, not inevitable. Okay. Other locations were considered but rejected for lacking religious connotations, colonial connections, or some sort of value to the elites. Zionism became a tool for European power brokers, and Palestinians paid the price for all of that in their blood, in their land, and in generations now of exile. The Nakba wasn't just some tragic accident, right? It was a planned purge, and they are still being purged, and the plan is still unfolding. Isn't that interesting? So let's look at the Rothschilds for a little bit. I want to be able to go to an hour. So let's look at the Rothschilds, the core idea. At its origin, the Rothschilds narrative, right? And we're talking about it's said that it's a conspiracy theory, okay? The Rothschilds narrative isn't about all Jews everywhere of all time. It's about a family-run transnational financial operation that operated above nations and monarchs. They played both sides of European wars, not out of evil, but out of economic strategy. If you fund both sides of the war, and you can find this stuff everywhere, this is common knowledge, okay? Then you make money no matter who wins or who loses. Because if people are borrowing money from your financial system to fight this war, they have to pay you back after, whether they win or lose. So none of it is about ethical or moral principles or a state of or feeling like you belong to a certain nationality or even a religious group. Funding both sides of the war makes money. They created a networked banking model where they funded royal houses, militaries, and even centralized banking, all while staying decentralized themselves and pretty much untouchable at that point. This was all a new thing in the 18th and 19th century, right? Because most power was still tied to land, to the military force, to the monarchies, those kind of things. So the Rothschilds, by the way, Rothschild is Ashkenaz, okay? The Rothschilds represented a banking dynasty that it didn't need a throne. They financed the thrones, okay? And yes, they're Jewish, right? But it was pure power strategy cloaked in religious, cultural identity for survival, for advantage. And if you said anything about it, you were called anti-Semitic, right? But this is an identity firewall, right? This is the same play as the Khazars before them. Spain man says, quote, "Give me control of a nation's currency, and I care not who makes the laws." Yes, thank you for that. This is a transnational, meaning goes across nations, a transnational finance power consolidation, identity manipulation that starts. Khazar playbook, right? But calling out someone who hides behind Judaism is automatically called anti-Semitic, right? But anti-Jewish people did use that to support their ideals, right? This critique of elitist banking networks morphed into accusations about the Jews control everything. The common everyday Jew doesn't. Remember when they split, the elites split themselves off during the Renaissance? They even split themselves, right? The everyday, and here we have the elites. The elites are where the Khazars went into, okay? People forgot that most Jews are not the Rothschilds, right? Many are poor, powerless, persecuted, those kind of things. So we have to call out the elite manipulators, not our fellow man. And to that end, oh, I didn't put it up here. Shoot, I thought I had it in my little PowerPoint, but I wanted to start using a phrase: supremacist, absolutist, predator. Supremacist, absolutist, predator. We all have seen these people throughout history, but because we didn't have language necessary to call it out, or we're called anti-Semitic, or we're called all these things, then it makes it difficult because we see supremacist, absolutist predators in the Roman Catholic Church, in the monarchies. We also see it in these elitist Jewish families. They are supremacist, absolutist predators. Okay. So the Khazar roots and the Rothschild parallels. Okay. So the Khazars were an elite class who used Judaism as a geopolitical cloak, right? The Rothschilds were a banking family who leveraged their Jewish identity to operate across borders, including places where Jews weren't allowed to go. But because they controlled the money, they control it all. Both used religion as an adaptive shield, an identity firewall. It was never a spiritual guide. It was never about spirituality. This is religion used as armor for these elite systems, and all the elites working together. Like how the British said they were bringing Christianity to justify colonization, murder, genocide, or how US leaders invoke God to sell you on oil wars and things like that, right? It's a sleight of hand. It's similar to how there are people today following ancient Judaism. They call themselves Hebrews or Israelites in Africa. Okay. There are Igbo people, Yoruba people. And while Judaism says, we don't want any of you in here, you can't possibly because you're Black, they did have to allow a certain Israelite group in because they could prove through their DNA that they were Israelites, interestingly enough. However, Judaism calls them the betas, beta Israelites, meaning secondary, lesser Israelites. It's the sleight of hand. They can prove it genetically, yet somehow somebody over here, like the Khazars, who just choose, we just choose we're Jewish one day, and everybody goes, oh, they're Jewish one day. But you have people who have centuries of tie and genetics to show that they are Hebrew, and they had to prove it, and they're still called less than. Why? Because elites rule the system. It's the sleight of hand. And elites love to blur the line until it has to include somebody they don't want to include. Because if they can make any critique of Rothschild style finance, Zionism, or Khazar elite sound anti-Semitic, like it's all anti-Semitic, then they're immune from any accountability, scrutiny, anything like that. But here's the thing, whether it's the Vatican, the Khazar nobility, Protestant empires, or even the Rothschilds' banks, religion and identity have always been co opted by elites to insulate themselves from the consequences of their actions. And this is why the bloodlines matter now more than ever. And that's where we're going to end. And we're going to, so in part 3, we're going to start getting into these bloodlines, what they mean, where they came from, why it's important. We're going to look at some videos in part 3 because sometimes it's good to have video evidence or other people saying the same thing that I'm telling you, because you don't want to take anybody's word for stuff. Look these things up. Look these things up that I'm telling you. See if it isn't true. Find it yourself. I mean, look at, Spain Man is putting quotes in the chat as I'm speaking, right? He's looking stuff up. That's perfectly acceptable. I don't have minions. I have subscribers. And I've learned so much from my subscribers making comments. Some of the stuff that I added today was because I looked at more stuff because of comments on the last video. So, I really, really, really appreciate that. Hi, Irvin Reed. He said, correct. We are called falasa, a derogatory term. Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't see that, but thank you for sharing that. So we will have next Sunday, we will have Khazar's part 3. And then after that, we will have the Goths, i.e. the Holy Roman Empire, part 2. And we will keep it moving into breaking it down into these bloodlines. Okay. I appreciate y'all being here. I hope you have a great Sunday. This Wednesday, we are continuing with the Book of Knowledge, the Keys of Enoch. If you want to come into that sort of classroom style live, you are more than welcome. But if you can't make it on Wednesday, I hope to see you next Sunday. And before I forget, I love you, I miss you, and you're my favorite. Please like the video if you haven't already. It really helps the algorithm to know what kind of things you like. Share where you think it's appropriate, especially to someone who you think needs to hear it. And don't forget to check out some of the wilder Pivot Point Wednesday shows. And last, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, especially if you want to break down complex concepts that make the esoteric not so teric, helping you on your journey to become your most authentic self. By subscribing, you'll join a community that thrives on curiosity and growth, and you'll never miss out on insights and some wild discussions. Let's uncover the universe together.